I grew up essentially in Florida, although we moved 19 times when I was a child as we were going into the space, as the space race was beginning. I then stayed in Florida and went to the University of Florida, was commissioned in the Air Force through the ROTC program, the Reserve Officers Training Program. After that, I went essentially into space systems, working with remote sensing, satellites, and ground stations. I worked in satellite procurement. I received 2 master's degrees while in the Air Force, a master's degree in systems engineering from the Air Force Institute of Technology, and a master's degree from the Naval War College in National Security Studies. When I reached the rank of colonel, I was transferred to the Pentagon, and I worked essentially on budget, and then I worked as an interagency planner for the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. It was in that role that I started to get into counterterrorism and understanding the way that the departments within Washington worked with each other, and started to then work toward working essentially a national security policy. That would have been 1995, 96, and 97. Yeah. I retired from the Air Force in 1997 and went to work for a small company in Washington, D.C., specializing in systems engineering. And I was working for that company when, on 9/11, 2001, when that occurred. I had an office in the Pentagon, but I was at a classified facility in the Washington, D.C. area during the 9/11 event. In that role that I was playing in that facility as a trusted agent for the intelligence community, I was asked to participate as part of a team to rebuild our air infrastructure, our air travel infrastructure. I spent a great deal of time in the White House and at the Federal Aeronautics Administration, and as well as in and around the beginning of DHS. DHS got formed in about 2005, but there were a series of other organizations that were being coalesced together as we tried to get air travel back to where it was prior to the 9/11 timeframe. Up until 9/11, essentially air travel was handled exclusively by the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. Following the catastrophe surrounding 9/11 and the use of airplanes as a weapon system by a terrorist organization, the decision was made to initially ground all air travel. And then what we were working on was restoring air travel in a logical and safe manner. So essentially what happened is the only air travel that was initially, the only aircraft that were initially allowed to fly were military or government only aircraft. And then they started to allow civilian aircraft to fly, but under certain protocols. As you recall, passengers were not allowed to get out of their seat either 30 minutes after until 30 minutes after takeoff, and they must remain in their seats 30 minutes prior to landing. Also, pilots were required to do special authentication when they were landing at certain airports, and it was a very difficult time for us. My role was we were introducing some technology that had been developed in the classified community into the interagency, into the groups that were looking at restoring this air traffic. That would be the FAA, the foundation of DHS, the military services, the Secret Service. As we tried to pull all that together, what our contribution was is we were bringing an all-source situational awareness system so that you could see what aircraft were in the air and you could understand whether or not they were deviating from their flight plan. Initially, the position of the White House, the position of Secret Services, Air Force One is the only airplane that's going to be allowed to fly from here on out. Obviously, we've moved a long way since then. But the idea is that we were part of a group that laid the foundation for the establishment of TSA and increasing the professionalism of the individuals checking passengers as they arrived at the airport. We then started to look at the air crews themselves and vetting them and making sure that they met consistent standards. They all met high standards, but they were inconsistent across the airlines. We looked at baggage, we looked at baggage handlers, we looked at maintenance. We as a group, not me personally, but the entire group was looking at all this as we were working to secure our borders and to implement a consistent approach to Homeland Security. This is when the Homeland Security organization, the Department of Homeland Security, was being formed and brought together to then oversee all of this. As you know, it was an amalgamation of 21 separate organizations. It took about two years to finally make the decision to pull them all together, because these organizations had been created and had worked as independent organizations for a number of years since their foundation, or since their creation rather. So the Department of Homeland Security was actually formed prior to Hurricane Katrina. It was put to its first major test during Katrina, and there's mixed reviews on how well it did. I personally think they did admirably under the circumstances, because in this country, before the federal agencies can get involved in a state or local issue, even if it's a major catastrophe, they have to be requested by the state and local officials, and that just did not happen expeditiously. In fact, it's well documented that President George W. Bush pleaded with the governor of Louisiana and pleaded with the mayor of New Orleans to please authorize the inclusion of federal forces to allow us to bring in federal support to help in Katrina. We're getting much better at it now. Katrina was a terrible catastrophe, but I think the federal government performed admirably and has continued to perform admirably for natural disasters that have occurred since Katrina. When I first left the Air Force and then went into the private sector, but as a trusted agent, so you had your feet in both worlds. I was not an Air Force officer any longer, but I wasn't an actual private contractor. I was someone who had been an Air Force officer who was trusted and cleared to the highest security levels, and I worked alongside of my federal colleagues. By 2003, when my wife and I decided to form HBM Associates, we had seen that there was a need for groups of individuals to start to work on specific remedies for different parts of the events that led up to 9/11. The area that I worked on specifically was trying to understand how you could merge together the various systems operated by the military, operated by the civilian community, to be able to get a consistent, coherent situational awareness picture. So we spent about 3 years, up to about 2005, 2006, working very hard to see if we could get a consistent, coherent situational awareness picture. What we found at the end of that time, we actually went into the White House to brief the results of our study. We did a whole series of experiments that involved these systems and various airliners. And what we found out was, once the wheels go into the well after the airplane takes off, if there are terrorists on board, right now there are only two outcomes. It's binary. Either the airplane is going to continue on to destination and it'll be destroyed and all the people will die as well as the people on the ground, or it'll be shot down. On those very rare occasions when like on United 93, when the passengers on board try to take over, typically what happens is what happened on 93. It crashed anyway, even though they were incredibly heroic and did deeds that are far beyond anything that you and I could probably ever imagine us doing. They were tremendous heroes. Every one of them were heroes. So what we found through that process is, no matter how good our situational awareness was, we needed to better understand when terrorists might attack our airlines or our transportation system. So if you can imagine a timeline, what we discovered is that Al-Qaeda and terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda start to plan for terrorist attacks 5 to 10 years in advance. So we started to move left on the timeline. We started to go back in time and said, well, how can we determine the targets that Al-Qaeda is potentially targeting? How can we see who they're going after? Because they have a very consistent template of surveillance, of planning, of resurveillance, and rehearsal. So what we started to do in our company, HBM Associates, is assemble a group of experts who were either retired FBI agents, CIA agents, people like myself, or people like Tomer Benito, who actually came out of the Israeli equivalent to the FBI and CIA, brought him on board so that we could start to train first responders on how to understand that you're being surveilled and characterize the place in the planning cycle that the people conducting the surveillance are at. We won a contract with the Department of Homeland Security. We won one with the State Department, and we started to teach first responders across the United States on how you can in fact determine if you are being surveilled by Al-Qaeda. And the way we did it was brilliant, and it's not brilliant because it was my idea, it was actually Tomer's idea. We took first responders, and these are people like paramedics, policemen, military officers. They were also civil servants as well as elected officials from various cities that we taught, and we brought them together and we formed Al-Qaeda surveillance teams out of them. And you know how people sit side by side in an audience when they're friendly? Well, what we did is we went down the rows and we said, you, and you are part of a team. And then we went down the road this way, you're part of a team, you're part of a team. And what we did was we had them conduct surveillance of various locations and report back on the attack scenario they would use. For example, we conducted this course twice in Las Vegas. We made arrangements with casinos, we made arrangements with the casino security chiefs, and we conducted surveillance where we had police officers coupled with Air Force sergeants, coupled with paramedics and firemen that would go in and do surveillance, and the only people that knew that they were in there conducting the surveillance were the chiefs of security. They didn't even tell their security forces because they wanted to see if their security forces noted something out of order. They brought in cameras, they brought in listening devices, in some cases they placed things on the floor just to see if a box or a suitcase might be moved. And in many cases, eventually the security staff recognized something was wrong, confronted our people, and removed them and the device. But of course we were able to have the chief of security step in and say, no, these guys are really part of a class that we're teaching. All of these people who were involved in law enforcement or professional security, once you asked them to step over to the dark side, if you will, they were incredibly inventive. And it was very interesting to watch how they would search for vulnerabilities. We built briefings on what happened. We had not only briefing charts, but we had footage, video footage, and still photography. And we went back to each of the casinos or each of the federal buildings or state buildings, as we did this across the nation. We sat down with the security staff, not only the security chief, but the security staff, and we briefed them. This is what happened. Here's where we think your vulnerabilities might be. And it was a great opportunity not only to raise the awareness and raise the professionalism across the United States of these groups, but it also continued to give us insights into how this might work. We had individuals that were working for us that actually went out and found online Al-Qaeda handbooks, how to attack handbooks. We actually used those. We explained how to set up intelligence networks, how to use people in your community that might be observing odd behavior to report that to the proper authorities. We worked with the fusion centers that are springing up across the United States. Now what's happened since that time, about 2008, 2009, we detected a wind shift. We detected a sea state shift, if you will. What was happening is these types of companies like HBM were starting to see their contracts diminish. And in fact, what we were seeing is the money that was being spent on companies like HBM, that money was moving into the universities. And it makes good sense because what's happening is that the government wants to see accredited programs that are focused on crisis and emergency management. And so what we decided to do with HBM is that Karen took over the predominant role in the company to work the contracts that we have. And I then started to go to the FBI Citizens Academy. I just graduated from the Las Vegas Metro Police Academy, Citizens Academy. I've taken online courses, and I'm going to be instructing in the master's degree program for crisis and emergency management. I'm going to be teaching exercise planning and development at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And we're seeing that happen across the United States, that there's going to be colleges and universities that are going to build programs to focus on homeland security and averting terrorism. And it's very analogous to what I saw as a young man growing up, where in the space race we never had aerospace engineers, we never had people that were getting master's degrees in interstellar navigation, but they're doing it now because there was a need for it. So what we're seeing is the same trend occurring again. Small mom and pop companies like HBM started out as, assembling renowned experts, conducting and winning contracts to do homeland security training. And then we see a migration where the government says, you know, this is working out pretty well, so what we need to do is we need to start spending our money on accredited programs at major universities, and that's what's happening. The exciting thing is that what happens then is you get a consistent, accredited series of courses that are looked at by professional educators, and they then award degrees in homeland security and crisis and emergency management, so that when a graduate gets out of one of these programs and puts out his or her resume, that a company that needs that kind of expertise knows precisely what they got, and they realize they got it from a major university. The University of Nevada, Las Vegas, UNLV, is the premier school teaching this. There's also George Mason University back in Washington, D.C. So we feel very fortunate. It's almost like a Harvard and Yale combination in this country as far as the teaching homeland security. We believe that we are premier. We also know that George Mason is very well recognized and respected. Las Vegas has the largest private professional security force in the world. What's interesting is that you'll find people who want to escape from the law, or want to escape from an ex-spouse, or perhaps someone that they want to be an ex-spouse, and they'll come to Las Vegas, right? Well, they're going to come to the place where surveillance has been raised to a science, and where professional security officers are virtually everywhere. And so they're coming exactly to the wrong place if they want to disappear, because the facial recognition technology that is used by casinos is incredible. From the moment you walk into a casino to the moment you leave, you're under surveillance. And we all accept that here in Las Vegas. In fact, in the Las Vegas chapter of the FBI Citizens Academy Alumni Association, we just created 2 awards. It's called the Jerry Bussell Leadership Award, and it's for outstanding leadership in law enforcement, 1 award, and in professional security. So we recognize in the FBI Citizens Academy that law enforcement and professional security, especially in this town, must be co-equal and must work hand in hand. Because any kind of a terrorist event, any kind of a bomb that's being left in a trash can, or any kind of an active shooter that might come into a casino, is going to be confronted initially by professional security. So we believe that professional security must receive this kind of training. And in fact, I've met my students that I'll be teaching starting this summer, and about half of them are in professional security, either here in Las Vegas or at various cities around the United States. The master's degree program, it's the Executive Crisis and Emergency Management master's degree program, because what you're now going to do is you're going to take individuals who are educated in a variety of disciplines at the baccalaureate level, and you're going to give them an opportunity to get a master's degree in professional security, if you will, and be able to then go back into that profession for the first time at a higher level, or if they're at a level right now, they will get additional pay when they go back to their job and now have a master's degree that is solely focused on them doing their job better. If you don't retool, I think, yourself and your company, I think what we found with HBM is that immediately after 9/11, there was incredible amounts of work, incredible amounts of opportunity, and it was very challenging. Myself, my wife, our team were working upwards to 100 hours a week in some cases, because the work was so intense and the need, the priority was so high. Clearly, over time, that adrenaline started, in the form of cash, started to be reduced. We saw less focus on how do we characterize the problem and how do we prevent this from happening again? How do we now manufacture those things that we discovered will in fact help, whether it's going to be improved airline cockpit doors so that people can't get into the cockpit, whether it's higher levels of screening. We've got the air marshals now trained and they're riding on any number of national and international flights. TSA has gone through significant growing pains, and they're always they always are looked at a little bit like a major inconvenience, but they are starting to become very, very professional. I know the people at the top of TSA are working very hard to overcome that very derisive perception that they perhaps justifiably earned in the early days when they were just hiring anybody to come to work for TSA, and the folks that they were hiring were patting down 6-year-old kids or 95-year-old people in wheelchairs. We're moving in the right direction. So what we're seeing is a shift in the amount of emphasis being put into homeland security and professional security, and the shift comes from not only implementing the research and development decisions and products that were being developed, but also shifting to universities. An example, HBM Associates won a contract through the Technical Support Working Group, TSWG, and we built under contract for the State Department an air handling system, a system which could be then put into a room this size, into an average conference room, and if any biological or chemical device were exploded outside an embassy or outside of an ambassador's residence or outside of a bank or outside of an office building, the occupants of that building could gather in the conference room, and we gave them 6 hours of clean air because of the filtering system that was developed. Well, rescue teams came in to extricate them. And what we've seen is we won that contract, we manufactured a prototype, we were able to successfully test the prototype, but the follow-on funding has not yet come through. It's been very frustrating because we did an incredibly efficient job in building it. We assembled a great team. We have a great manufacturer, and we're sitting here waiting for funding to come through because either the money's not there or it's being spent in some other location, even though the threat's still there. And you're right from the standpoint of how many biological or chemical terrorist attacks have we had on office buildings in the United States? How many attacks have we had against our embassies around the world since the Kenyan embassy explosion, and since the FBI, who's in CIA, are so incredible at finding these people before they're able to carry out an attack? How many have we had? Well, we haven't had very many. So do we need the air filtration system that we built? I would say, yeah, we do, because we know the terrorists are still out there. We know they're still trying to work against our national interests and against our citizens, not only in the United States but also in Australia. So what's happened is we've seen many of the funding sources that dry up for those things that the terrorists have chosen not to exercise, those capabilities they've chosen not to exercise.
And unfortunately, it's probably likely to take a major event before.
Unfortunately, that's the case.
And that's generally and that happens at all levels of security.
Certainly,
at a local level.
Absolutely true. And if you look at TSA, for example, every time TSA comes under scrutiny and they talk about transitioning it to the private sector and on and on and on, somebody's going to try to carry a bomb or explosive material through TSA. They get caught, And of course, then you think, aha, you know, we don't need to get rid of these people. We finally got them trained. We don't need that on one of our airliners. Just as soon as the airline doors, the doors that keep the captain and the pilot safe, the cockpit doors, cost upwards to, I think it's $1 million. They're very, very expensive doors. And every time you think about, God, was that expense worth it? You have some crazy person pounding on the door saying, I'm gonna destroy this airplane. And that just happened recently with a captain. So what occurs is that every time there's a vulnerability, we see people try to exploit it. And so we've been fortunate in a way in this country, because what's happened is we have not diminished our attention with airliners regarding air travel. We realize that it's still vulnerable, it's still a target. Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Appreciate your time. All the best. Thanks, Sandy.